The Liberation of Sundrian City by Andrew Lewis. Chapter 28. Look On. Linus lifted his hand and knocked hard on the thick wooden door before he had a chance to hesitate. The sound echoed around him through the night, and he wondered why he knocked so hard. Princess Robin shifted awkwardly on her feet behind him, and he felt her sweaty hand still gripping his shirt. Finally, the door creaked open. Linus! Butch, you have to let us in. You have to hide us. What is... Light beamed from the house as Butch Ormine stood at his door in his bedwear. Of course, my boy, I thought... Let us in, Butch. I'll tell you everything. Soon enough, they sat at the table, speaking still in hushed tones. Linus introduced Butch to Princess Robin and proceeded to tell their story. Butch's wife entered the room too, wearing her bedgown and tangled hair and carrying a water jug and cups. She had been stirred from her rest by the voices and come to see who their guests were, her eyes squinting from her puffy face. She hugged Linus first, and then turned to the strange girl in their sunroom. When Linus introduced her, Mrs. Ormine gasped and made her way shuffling out of the room. Butch smiled to Princess Robin reassuringly. Please excuse my wife. It's not often we have royalty here, Princess. Not at all, replied Robin with a weak smile. Butch turned back to Linus. So no one knows you have escaped yet? I don't think so, no. Well, that gives you a good chance to hide well. But what next? You can't just live in hiding for the rest of your lives. We escape, whispered Robin. Escape? Butch shot a perplexed look to the princess. The city. We escape Sundrian City. Silence befell the room, and Butch and Linus swallowed hard. Mrs. Ormine shuffled back into the room and sat beside Princess Robin with a small basin of warm water and a cloth. She proceeded to clean the dirt from around her face. Oh, look at these grazes. How does a princess get such grazes on her face? This will never do. From tree branches, Robin answered. Mrs. Ormine nodded and proceeded to tend to the princess with a cloth, seemingly unaware of the severity of the situation she was amidst. My princess, you will surely die if you leave the city walls. Mrs. Ormine let out a small squeal, which was met by a stern look from Butch. She composed herself and continued cleaning the princess without a word. Only Ramil has ever made it back alive from outside. The creatures out there, they're vicious and cruel. They will not harm me, Mr. Butch. Why? How can you know? I cannot know for sure, but it is my belief that those creatures are not a danger to us. I believe there are other cities still thriving with humans. Goresh, who has also ventured out of our city walls many times, tells me of such places. He tells me he has never encountered any magical creatures except for in the stories of old. I believe we can survive out there. Linus will agree with me on this. Linus tentatively nodded. Deep down, he didn't feel as certain as the princess did. He had lived 13 years in fear of the outside world, and to disarm that fear device so deeply ingrained in his mind seemed easier said than done. It was as if by instinct alone he was afraid to go outside the walls, and instinct can be a difficult thing to ignore. I agree, Butch. I have seen written works about the outside world, other cities, other cultures, still existing to this day. I believe our ancestors lied to us. Butch sat back in his chair with a loud sigh. The two of you sound like those darn outlaws. The deft. His face darkened. Linus, there is something you should know about them, about Evander. He has joined them, I know. I saw when they helped him escape the trial. Yes, of course you did, but there is something more. He came to me not long ago, sat just where you are now. He looked sadder, darker than I've ever seen him. Any trace of the friendly, good-natured man that he used to be was completely gone. He looked like a man who would do whatever it took to have his way. He told me his plot to leave the city on a covert mission, to return with evidence of an outside city. His beliefs are the same as yours. Linus merely breathed for a moment, anger growing in him with every fall of his chest. That man killed my parents, he scolded finally. And you let him come here and go as he pleases? Why didn't you turn him in? Linus, I don't believe he considers you an enemy. It seemed to me that he wants to make amends with you, to make things right between you. There is no right. He killed my parents, he bellowed. Yes, Butch agreed solemnly. But son, I can't bring myself to accept that those were simply mindless murders. There must have been a reason. A reason? Linus, listen. I believe you and Evander want the same thing. I think he could help you escape the city. When I spoke of you that day, he said nothing, but his sadness grew and filled this whole room. I honestly believe that if you want to leave this city, that man's your best hope. And so a few hours before the sun came up, Linus, Robin and Butch made their plan to leave the safety of the house and head out into the city. They had agreed to make the move before it became light and, more importantly, before the princess's escape had been discovered. The plan was to go to the farm of the man that Butch knew named Cretus Law, a man that Butch suspected was in league with the Deft. Linus had heard the name before. Cretus was a spinach farmer, not particularly noteworthy other than that he was the son of Cretus Law Sr., a famed swordsman who acted as a personal guard to Emperor Alois Frigg, Princess Robin's late grandfather. When Cretus Sr. died in service, Alois Frigg gifted their family the spinach farm as a loyalty reward, and the family had lived there ever since. Linus was doubtful of the plan, but regardless had reluctantly agreed to meet with the farmer. From there, so the plan was, Robin and Linus would meet with the conspirators of the Deft and conspire to leave the city. These were enemy ranks as far as Linus was concerned, but nonetheless he eventually agreed with Butch that they would attempt to team with the Deft in their quest to leave the city. And the matter was settled, for the meantime. Secretly, though, Linus had an idea of his own. He wanted to meet with the Deft as a means to confront and murder Evander Diarmaid. And so they wandered through the city, Butch proudly strutting as he usually would, so as to remain inconspicuous. Linus close behind with his head downturned and his hand casually toying with the handle of his short sword. And Robin, draped in hooded cloaks and veils, staying close by his side always. For added camouflage, the princess carried a pail and a parcel of rosemary branches wrapped in twine that had been taken from the pantry of the Ormines' kitchen. A small dagger given to her by the Ormines was hidden at her waist. Linus carried an armoured chain-link vest, also a gift from the Ormines, and also acting as camouflage, as it was the Ormines' business to build and test body armour. "Come on, keep up," Butch would hiss at his two hired hands when another early riser would enter their proximity, adding a flustered "morning" with a casual nod to the passer-by. It was apparent the disguise was working quite well merely by gauging their reactions to this. Some would offer a weak smile back or a tip of their head, others might mutter something in response, but all of them seemed entirely disinterested and kept on with their doings as if the exchange hadn't even disrupted them from their thoughts. More dim lights began to flicker in the windows of the houses once they reached the middle-class area of the city. The smell of baking bread floated through the air, the quiet of the morning interrupted by the shuffling of grumpy feet, but still uninterrupted by voices, as if it was agreed upon by the city's working class that it was still far too early to bother speaking to one another. More and more people wandered the streets, but they were mere shadows, going about their business. Pink light was threatening to engulf the horizon, although the stars were still visible in the sky for the moment. It was too dark to make out faces and remained so through the lower class areas where families argued with crying babies and doors creaked open and closed. The stars began to fade as they moved along the shacks that lined the dirt pavements of the farming district. They had strayed to the far eastern side of the farms, down long dirt roads that wound between crops, and finally found themselves walking through a neat crop of spinach towards a small but well-kept house that was glowing with candlelight from behind curtained windows. "Here we go," said Butch, and Linus felt the princess's hand on his back stiffen and tighten around his shirt. Butch raised his hand to the door and pounded 3 times, and immediately they heard shuffling from inside and the clinking of glassware. Whispers were exchanged, and Linus, trying to put images to the noises he heard through the door, imagined a sword being lifted and the chain being released on the inside of the door. It opened, and the face peered out from the crack and said in a deep rumble, "Who are you?" Cretus, I am Butch Ormine, son of Butch Senior, armour smith. I have with me Linus Smith, friend or perhaps enemy of Evander Diomede, and his accomplice, the disowned Princess Robin Frigg of the Sundrian City Palace. They seek your shelter and assistance. The man moved back from the door and it opened to reveal him, a tall man with long, muscular arms and large, hunched-forward shoulders. His jaw was shrouded by a black growth of beard, and his dark hair was wet and oily, combed backward along his head. His expression was unyielding, suspicious, dark eyes hiding in the shadows of dark sockets and large eyebrows that were lowered in thought. He turned and walked back into his home, speaking, "Come in," as he did, and Linus saw that he held not a sword, but a dagger in his hand. They exchanged unsure glances among themselves and followed the rather unnerving man named Cretus into his home. As they crossed into the entrance, Linus saw 5 men sitting on hammocks, flames glowering around them. They had clearly been woken moments before. Cretus beckoned his guests to be seated at the table in the sunroom, an extended room with a table larger than most and at least a dozen seats. As they sat, Cretus whispered to presumably his wife, and she nodded and left the house silently. "Welcome to my home, Princess Robin, and Butch, thank you for your efforts thus far. Linus, Evander will be pleased that you made contact." Linus shifted wordlessly in his seat. "Thank you," said Butch. Cretus's eyes remained fixed on Linus a moment. On the table before him he fingered his dagger, spinning it beneath his palm. "You've made a good decision in bringing him here. Evander will indeed be pleased. He's spoken of you often, boy. He wants nothing more than to meet with you again. Unfinished business, he calls it." Linus still struggled to produce words. The man's looming presence seemed to sap him of his voice. He fought an urge to turn to Butch for support. Instead he remained still, mirroring the man's dark gaze as unflinchingly as he could. "You've nothing to fear, boy. A friend to Evander is a friend to us." "Us?" said Butch. "A friend?" said Linus. Cretus flicked his eyes to Butch as if choosing to ignore Linus's question. "Yes, us. I presume you have linked me to the rebel group known as the Deft. This is true, I am head swordsman. I tell you this in good faith, on the request of Evander himself. He assures me that Linus here can be trusted with the truth, with our secrets, and has instructed that in the event of you making contact, we are to tell you everything. He trusts you, so the Deft trusts you. Behind you are the men of my band. We are the swordsmen of the rebellion. I am in charge of their training, and if it comes to battle, their leader in warfare. They are some of the finest swordsmen in the city, I believe." They turned to see the 5 surly men scratching at their asses and heads. They looked tough, but rather unkempt. "Just 5 swordsmen in this whole rebellion?" Butch asked, with a hint of disbelief in his words. Cretus looked shyly at the ground and shrugged. "We're not a big movement, I admit." "And what part does Evander play in this?" "Ah, a very important one. He is primarily the leader of the ranged assault team. There are 6 men in his command, mostly archers, but for 1 man who throws a mean spear. But perhaps more importantly, he helps guide the rebellion. He helps us decide upon our next moves. He has a knack for plotting, planning and scheming, a natural leader and smart as a tack. We've made good headway as an organisation in the short time since he's come on board. In fact, it's a little embarrassing to think just how disorganised we were before him. He'll be here soon. She'll be pleased to see you." Before the sentence was finished, Linus was on his feet. "No," he exclaimed. "What is it, boy?" begged Cretus, startled by the outburst. A hand landed on each of Linus's shoulders, one belonging to Butch, the other to Princess Robin, and both equally gentle in their touch. They lowered him softly back to his seat. "Linus," it was Robin who spoke, "you need to face him eventually." The words came slowly and gently, and as they came, Linus realised just how little the princess had said in the last day or so. He realised just how scared she was, and knew in that moment that his own fear paled by comparison to hers. And as her eyes shifted nervously back to the table, Linus put a hand on her knee and spoke to Cretus with a courage measurable by the quivers in his voice. "He is to come unarmed. I will have my short sword and armour. Your swordsmen are to leave the house before his arrival. These are my demands. He will have 5 minutes to speak, and at the end of those 5 minutes, I will make up my mind on our next move. These are my demands, and I make them with the leverage that we hold between us. He motioned at the princess. Valuable information. Information that could be the key to escaping this city. Critus leaned back in his chair and, with a sly smile, declared, "It is agreed, Linus." Linus felt a pang of terror. "Excellent," he said, swallowing hard. "How long will he be?" "Within the hour." "Excellent," Butch repeated, turning to see the now empty hammocks. "May we take this opportunity to rest briefly?" "Of course." Linus looked doubtfully at the hammocks. He could use the sleep, but was certain it would elude him his efforts to find it. Alas, he would try. Without another word, he and the princess stood and moved to the hammocks and slumped into them. Between heavy blinks of his eyes, he noticed the flaying wood grain of the wax-soiled sill beside his head. In the darkness of his imagination, he saw swords swinging and blood spraying, elephant feet crushing skeletons, and Deimos sneering angrily. He saw his mother, dead amongst broken arrows, and the princess too, bloody on the floor of the basement. There was no peace to be found in his mind at all, until a whisper from beside him came. "Sleep well, murderer," it said, and he found some semblance of inner calm in her voice.